Hi, I'm Kristen Bell, and if you know my husband Dax, then you also know he loves shopping for a car. Selling a car? Not so much.
We're really doing this, huh?
Thankfully, Carvana makes it easy. Answer a few questions, put in your VIN or license, and done. We sold ours in minutes this morning, and they'll come pick it up and pay us this afternoon.
Bye-bye, truckie.
Of course, we kept the favorite.
Hello, other truckie.
Sell your car with Carvana today. Terms and conditions apply.
Did you know that parents rank financial literacy as the #1 most difficult life skill to teach? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app for families. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Kids learn to earn, save, and spend wisely, and parents can rest easy knowing their kids are learning about money with guardrails in place. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/Wondery.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined as always by my Breaking It Down co-host, Brett.
Breaking it down. Breaking down. That's what I do. Break down.
Nobody wants to see Brett dance, but breaking down an interview is something that we do all the time, especially when we are working a case together, right? We interview thousands. That's not an exaggeration. Maybe tens of thousands at this point of interviews together. And obviously there's what happens in the interview. And then you debrief with your law enforcement officers and you debrief with your other attorneys. Brett and I debrief with each other. So you guys recently heard in the Asha Degree case, the Dedmon family, who has been subject to a couple search warrants that have been executed in that case and unsealed, has engaged a public relations person, I think that's the best way to put it, Skip Foster, who has a lot of connections to the Asha Degree case before he was retained by the Dedmons. But he came on our show to give the Dedmon side of the story. To be clear, if you listen to that episode, no charges have been filed, and the Asha Degree case is still an open case. But he did come on to talk to us about their side of the story. And if you haven't listened yet to that episode, I would say probably pause this episode, go listen to it before coming back here. Here is how we typically break down cases with each other, but there are a few caveats with this particular interview.
Yeah, and look, there's a few things I just want to say off the top. Number one, I know there are people who don't even like the idea of public relation firms, crisis communications people, spokespeople. I totally get that. But I'll just go ahead and tell you, in today's environment, in the same way that 20 years ago you would have said, somebody gets in trouble, they need to hire a lawyer, and you shouldn't judge them for that because that's the smart thing to do. In today's environment, in a big case, hiring someone who actually understands public relations is probably pretty smart. In this case, has made a lot of waves, and these people who are just ordinary people, regardless of if they have any involvement in this case, they are suddenly thrust into a spotlight they had never been in before. So I get that feeling, and I had that initial feeling as well, but I just think we need to give a little grace to people who are dealing with this new media world.
And to show that this is not the first time we're saying this, I don't even know if it's Legal Briefs or Prosecutors Pod. If you leave a 5-star review, you get to ask a question and we answer it. Several weeks, maybe months ago, one of the questions asked to us is, who would you hire to defend you if you were guilty of committing a crime? And those of you who listened may remember my answer. We kind of chuckled at it, but I was being serious. I said, forget the lawyer. I'm hiring good PR and probably a documentary crew to make a documentary about how I'm innocent, because we have seen how podcasts like Serial, documentaries, you can name a host of different criminal defendants who've been convicted who have been able to change public opinion because of well-executed PR campaigns. So I note that because in today's age, crisis management is a very real thing we have to do, especially with something that we talked about with Skip near the end of our conversation, which is keyboard warriors. Whatever, and we'll get into the substance of what he is talking about regarding the Dedmons. Whatever the Dedmons have or do not have a role in Asha Degree's disappearance, one thing is true. There is absolutely an online kind of mob rule execution by media or execution by Reddit happening in many cases. I don't know if it's happening specifically in this case. I would venture to say there are a lot of people talking about the Dedmons who know nothing about them and have no personal knowledge of the case. But that is a real problem for many reasons. We note some of this in our conversation. Witnesses are going to be very hesitant to come forward to help actually solve cases because they think, I'm just a Joe Schmo. I don't want to be thrust into the spotlight. But the second I call a hotline to report something that I just happened to see because I was standing at the right street corner at the right time, I'm going to all of a sudden be part of all these conspiracy theories on X, on Reddit. I don't want that to happen. So what do? They don't even put themselves forward with having information, and then investigations are massively hampered. Not to mention real people's lives who have nothing to do with a criminal case end up getting altered forever.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And that's just the world we live in, and it is the way it's going to be. The way this interview came about, Skip reached out to us, said they wanted to get their story out there. They wanted to share their story, and we've covered this case, and you heard us ask him about that, about why they decided to pick us. And look, I mean, I'm glad they did. I don't really know why they picked us, but I'm glad they did. And I'll say this, the way we approached this, and I think this came across in the interview, we wanted to give him every opportunity to share their story. We weren't trying to cross-examine him or tear him down or anything. We asked questions that we knew you guys would have, and we asked questions to advance the story. But it really was his opportunity, is the way I saw it, to speak for the Dedmons. We've talked about this. We've been very critical of the Dedmons in our previous discussions, but we were frankly going based solely on the affidavits with a search warrant. So I was glad to hear what they had to say, and I'm interested to talk more about it tonight.
And also with that, it was very clear when we went into the conversation that we were going to have our own thoughts. He couldn't control our questions either. So we were not trying to cross-examine him, but we recognized that he's not the person to cross-examine. He only knows as much as the Dedmons are telling him. And so he is a representative of the witness. I think that interview actually was a really good example of why you don't allow hearsay in court, right? He could only tell us how much he knew from his conversations with Mickey, a witness who came forward for the first time 24 years later, who happened to see a very key piece of evidence the night Asha disappeared. He can't really speak. He could not answer any of the questions we had about Mickey's recollection 24 years later because he's a third party. That's precisely why in court you have hearsay rules. He would be a terrible representative of what Mickey actually remembers and saw because he only knows as much as Mickey knows. And when you press on different sides, I've seen some people say, well, it fell apart under questioning. No, it's because it's one-dimensional when you are parroting back what someone knows. As what is questioning? Questioning is trying to look at that same statement from multiple angles. But if you only know the statement one-dimensionally because you were not there, you can't answer those questions. So I thought that was a fantastic example of why we don't typically allow hearsay. We want the person who saw it to be the one testifying to undergo cross-examination. So with that, there was a lot that was covered. One of the things we set up with, of course, is there were 4 buckets of evidence presented within the search warrant that has been unsealed. Those are not all the search warrants. In this case, we understand there are more that have not been unsealed. And we also understand that this is not all the evidence that exists in the Asha Degree case, but there were kind of 4 big buckets of evidence that concerned the Dedmons. And we gave Skip Foster an opportunity to respond to each of them.
We start with the car because that was the biggest part. I mean, that was the thing that he had the most to say about, I think, that bucket of information.
So the big thing about the car, which is new information, I don't think were in the affidavits, and I don't know if law enforcement knew at the time of the affidavits, is that the car, at least the title, was not in the Dedmon's family's name until a month after Asha disappeared. So the transfer happened in March of 2000. Asha disappeared in February of 2000. Now, that could be a very powerful piece of evidence. As you could tell from our questions, though, I'm not completely sold that that had everything to do with it here. First of all, we don't actually know that this is the car that may have been in question. There may not even have been a car in question. But what does a warrant do? A warrant goes down investigative leads. So we have witnesses who spot a car in the area. We'll talk more about how the car may or may not resemble the car ultimately seized as part of the search warrant. But I think it would be terrible investigation if you didn't try to pin down what this witness claims they saw with respect to a green car. Now, the reason I don't think it's the silver bullet or like the smoking gun that the car was transferred a month later is exactly what he kind of conceded in the conversation. It didn't come from a dealership. It came from a private party. He stopped short, and he may not know. So I'm not saying that this is all the information. This is why there's the limitation of what he knows. He said the car did not come from a family member. I don't think he ruled out, nor may he know, that the car came from someone they could have access to, even if it's not a family member. So there are people who can give you a car or have access to a car, a neighbor, a good friend, maybe someone else who drove it all the time, who worked at the residential living, for example, and it was just an administrative task to finally sign the car over to someone. So as we know, there are, even within state laws, there's a period of time in which, a grace period in which you can have before you have to officially transfer the car into your name. And typically when you look at those types of records, when we get records in cases, those are things we have to kind of corroborate with other information. Is March really when the Dedmons took possession of the car? That question is still a question mark to me.
And look, I think there's an interesting question in this entire case, sort of a meta question. And we touched on this a little bit, but didn't go into detail when we were talking to him. And that's whether or not this approach by law enforcement is appropriate and helpful. I fully understand why they're doing this the way they're doing it. They want to bring attention to this case. It's relatively old. They want to get people talking about this case. They're hoping to generate memories in people who saw things, have information they don't know they have. They're trying to put pressure on the Dedmons, if they are involved, to come forward and give more information and maybe admit what they did if they're involved. That's why they're doing it the way they're doing it. But it is a choice to do this in such a public way. And when you do this in such a public way, one of the risks you run is people read those affidavits and they think they're gospel. They read them and they think, well, if the police officer is writing this in the affidavit and signing it, then two things are true. Number one, this is exactly what happened. And number two, if later on we learn the reality is different, then the police officer lied in that affidavit and is a bad person and probably should be fired and go to prison and everything else, right? And that's just not reality. An affidavit is, number one, a snapshot of the information you know at the time you sign it. And number two, has an interpretive gloss where you are giving your sort of professional opinion as a law enforcement officer about what these disparate facts mean and how they give you probable cause, not certainty, not more than 50%, probable cause, a sort of a reason based on logic to think you're going to find evidence where you're searching. So when that happens, the other thing it does, and sort of the downside of doing this, is if you're the Dedmons, it opens the door for you to attack the affidavit as it's written, to go after what's in the affidavit, even if the affidavit doesn't reflect reality and isn't even really the police's ultimate theory. And so how do you see that here? Well, Skip, in our conversation with him, is mostly attacking the theory that one of the girls was driving this car, hit Asha, they decided to cover it up, her parents then helped cover it up, and that's how we got where we are. If you don't believe that theory, or if you think that theory is just sort of the best law enforcement can come up with based on what they know now, then it's almost, I'm not saying he created a straw man, because he didn't. He's attacking what's in the affidavit. But if that's not reality, then that attack doesn't actually mean anything. It's a good attack on a theory that was false. It doesn't go to what really happened, if that makes sense.
And if you remember, before we ever spoke to Skip, even knew that he existed, or that the Dedmons wanted to get an alternate story out there, we talked about the warrant exactly in this manner. We said at the time, based on no inside knowledge, that we thought the facts that they had at their disposal at the time best fit the theory they were putting forward, but that was not actually the theory. And you could see this, for example, one of the ways that Skip was really attacking this theory was saying, there's no way these three girls could have done it. You know, one girl is only 13 years old. One is, he kept saying, approximately 16, because first of all, we all know that You could probably drive before you're 16, legally or not, is another question. But saying that she didn't have a license to drive, and then that leaves basically one girl who was old enough to drive. But we said in our initial analysis of the search warrant, what they were looking for is the suspects, or the suspect really was probably the dad, but they didn't have enough information to kind of fit that theory. And it's not that you're creating a theory around it, but think about the way you charge a case. There are lesser included crimes, and you can charge like higher and higher crimes, but it's all encompassed within one. As you get more information, your theory of the case may shift, even if you have a gut feeling. Like, I have a gut feeling it's really the dad, but I don't have any evidence to point towards that now. But what I can show here is there definitely does seem to be a triangulation of all this evidence. Even Skip says that. He says, all you have is DNA from the youngest daughter, and then a car that's driven by the oldest daughter or the middle daughter or something like that. I can't remember which one he said. And then a third guy who is very suspect, who just lives at one of these situations. That's just all grasping for straws. That's not grasping for straws from the law enforcement perspective. There's a lot of smoke around here, and what is the common denominator of all those disparate facts that shouldn't be circulating around Asha? Asha shouldn't be having any contact, Skip said, with the 13-year-old daughter. DNA was found in her belongings. With the Underhill man who lived at one of the Dedmon facilities. Exactly. That's where you start triangulating. That's where your investigation leads you to say, what is the common denominator here? And when you can't pin it down to one person, this is why you charge conspiracies or that sort of thing, is you're not exactly sure who the individual is that you're really after, because it's within this family. Something is pointing to this family, and it's going to be unlikely, I think, that it's the 13-year-old daughter, for example, or the 15-year-old daughter, or the 17-year-old daughter, for that matter.
And if that is their theory, and if that's the theory they land on, then obviously everything he said becomes even more powerful. But I thought he did a really good job of going at that theory, that that's what happened. I mean, I thought the points he made were pretty good. Like, take the Rambler, for instance. So the police have identified the Rambler. There's a green car involved based on a witness from way back when. We don't know who they are. We don't know exactly what they said. All we know is they said they saw Asha get pulled into a green car. That's all we know from this witness. It actually came out a decade afterwards. I don't know why they held that information back for so long, but nevertheless. So that's all we know. So when the police seized the Rambler, that in the public's mind, they think that's the green car. They're saying that's the green car. And so that enables Skip to say, well, here's all the reasons that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't actually look like the car that was described. The car that was described is 2-door, it's 4-door. The car that was described is a late 70s model, it's an early 60s model. 2-tone green, this is 1-tone green, right? I mean, he does a really good job. It was almost like, he's not a lawyer, but it was almost like a defense attorney attacking a case, right? You're attacking what the state's putting on. You don't have to do anything on your own. You're just going after what they put on. And when you're doing that, you can be really effective. But here's the thing, much like the theory of the case, that might not be the green car at all. The Dedmons had a lot of cars. They had a couple green cars, right? So I say all this to say, it's really interesting to be in a situation where you're in such early stages, relatively, of an investigation, and you have an affidavit by law enforcement, and you see sort of the attack on the affidavit already happening, when it may be that the affidavit is wrong in many instances. And just think about the Delphi case. The first search warrant in that case is against Ron Logan. And people have focused on that search warrant to this day. Well, the police had good reasons to put what they did in the search warrant and to do that search, but it turned out it wasn't him. They were wrong about their ultimate conclusion. So that very well could be the case here. It could be fully the case. They're just completely wrong. It's not the Dedmons at all. Or it could be that there are parts of the affidavits that are wrong. There are assumptions that are wrong. There are things that they're putting in the affidavit that they have reason to believe. They don't know. They have reason to believe that supports their request from a judge to give them a warrant to go on someone's property and search. That's the whole point of this. We're not even to an indictment, much less a trial.
Right. And I wanted to point that out multiple times because I think you can get carried away. Think, well, the police are intentionally misleading. No, an investigation is a living, breathing thing. Things change as you get information. That's why, and just to put it into perspective, depending on the type of case, some cases don't require search warrants at all. More complex cases, and this is a complex case because we're 25 years out, it's still an open case. We still haven't found Asha. So it's very much a complex case. Brett and I have worked on cases where there are dozens of search warrants. Now, I will say, typically they stay sealed until an indictment is filed. In this case, we only know about these because the state chose to unseal them, because that's who decides to unseal them. And you're allowed to unseal them. Typically, you don't unseal them because it's an ongoing investigation. It could hinder your investigation. You can imagine if someone knew the avenue or the theories you're pursuing, they can then cover up their tracks before you ever get to them, right? These are the theories of why law enforcement doesn't open up their files if an investigation's ongoing. Kind of similar with the search warrant. The other thing with that is names are listed in the search warrant. So when I unseal a case, I want to make sure that like the names being out in the public need to be out there because there's like a real nexus to what's happening. I don't know what the theory is as to why these particular affidavits and search warrants were unsealed. Based on the affidavits in these search warrants, there were other search warrants in this case. I would not be surprised that there are. I can see many actually additional search warrants needed just based on the theory of the evidence, the theories based on the evidence they have. Now, so the other big piece of evidence that I didn't know about before was, of course, Mickey. Mickey is a witness who came forward 24 years later, September of 2024, stating that he saw Asha and a two-toned green car the night of her disappearance. Okay, I have a lot of questions there. So he is apparently now gone to law enforcement. Apparently he's known to law enforcement. This has not appeared in any affidavit. At first, I was a little wary of even talking about him because I don't know how he fits into the case if I was going to do something to hinder the case. But the fact that Mickey willingly on his own spoke to a journalist, right, a PR guy, it was going to get out there anyway. So you're, as a witness, allowed to go speak to whoever you want. So the fact that he's already spoken to someone who other than law enforcement, and we knew that the Dedmon's representatives were going to get Mickey's story out there, I'm okay talking about him now. But Mickey was not previously known about, in this case, to the public. And he himself said he never went to law enforcement before September, but that he has known about this. It's not a recovered memory. It's not something that he all of a sudden remembered 24 years later because a search warrant was made public or a search warrant was executed in the case. He's known about this all along. Okay, here are my issues. This doesn't have to do with Skip Foster or the Dedmons. Here's my issue with Mickey. Obviously, his testimony is adopted wholesale by Skip, as he should, because Mickey's testimony is basically saying the green Rambler that was seized from the Dedmons doesn't match Mickey's description of what he saw that night. I understand why the Dedmons want to wrap their arms around Mickey. Here's my problem with Mickey, and these are not questions that Skip can or really should be expected to answer on behalf of Mickey. Why would you come forward 24 years later? And it's not an excuse. This was the excuse given that apparently Mickey gave to Skip and the Dedmons, is that, well, the green car was already known. Not true. The green car was not known to the public until 10 years later. Second, it was wrong. The green car that came out 10 years later actually did not match what he knew. Number 3, he says that he actually knew Mama and Papa, Asha's grandparents. You see someone you know's granddaughter get pulled into a car and you're like, you know what? Police probably got this. At the very least, I'm telling Mama and Papa, right? I'm not pointing fingers at Mickey. I'm saying this entire testimony, 24 years later, it has to be criticized and very examined before you accept it wholesale. So right now, where I stand without more answers, I do not accept it whole cloth. I look at it very skeptically. If I'm in law enforcement, in fact, we're going to start talking to you, Mickey, because I'm really interested in what you have to know and more than just what you saw in that green car. What were you doing the night of February 13th, 2000? Where were you? How well did you know Asha?
Why were you out in a storm at 1 o'clock in the morning?
What did you call Asha? What did you call Mama and Papa? What did you think about the car that came out 10 years later? Okay, so I want to be careful because this was a bombshell in the Dedmon's revelation. Understand if I'm them hugging Mickey real close. I'm saying we don't know yet enough. We can't break it down for you more than that, except to say, looking at this pretty skeptically, you can't accept it wholesale, what we've heard here.
Yeah, and look, and I think, Alice, the point we're trying to make here is I fully understand why the Dedmons want to highlight this, because it undermines the police's case, and we're going to talk about some other things that undermine it as well. Fully understand that. But this is so hard when you have witnesses who come forward so much later and you're trying to figure out what they know. And you're trying to question them. Covering the West Memphis 3 case on the other podcast. And you got a lot of people who try and remember things, and it's really hard. And this person, granted, like Alice said, they've known about this the whole time. So it's not like a recovered memory, as we're going to talk about in a second, or something you'd not really thought about. They've known about this the whole time. The reason they're so important is Mickey's supposed to be a car guy. Now, if you've seen the pictures of the Rambler and you've seen pictures of other possible vehicles as described in the FBI bulletin, they do look different. And in the light of day, sitting at my computer, yeah, they don't look the same to me at all.
I'll be totally honest. As a not car person, even in the light of day, I'm like, I could totally mistake the two.
Well, I mean, I would hope in the light of day you could count the number of doors, right? But that's if you knew you were doing that. If I said, go tell me the differences between those two cars, you could do that. If you were standing on your front porch and one of those cars drove by and I came by 2 minutes later, not 2 decades later, 2 minutes later, and I said, hey, that car that just went by, describe it to me. You might not be able to describe anything because you might not have really paid attention. But say like something weird was going on with the car. I mean, say a girl who you knew was getting pulled into the car, right? So you were focused on the car.
The you knew part is incredibly key here.
Yeah.
That you knew.
That you knew. And think about this. You might think, well, if that were happening, I'd know exactly what that car looked like. But would your focus be on the car? Or would it be on what you saw happen? And would that allow you to say things like, well, I think it was 2 doors. It's actually 4 doors. How much attention were you paying? 2-tone green. It's actually 1-tone green, right? Like these things, would you really recognize them? Now, Mickey says he's a car guy and that he would. The interesting thing, we have no idea who the first person is. So the fact that they would mistake a relatively popular car, the Thunderbird, the Continental, or the Oldsmobile, or whatever it was, right? For a car that, frankly, you probably rarely saw on the road by the late 70s when that car came out, and certainly by 2000, a Rambler. I mean, I've never seen a Rambler in my life out in the world. I've seen a Thunderbird. I've seen a Lincoln Continental. I've seen a lot of cars from the 70s, sort of boxy 70s cars. I've never seen a Rambler. I wouldn't say that was a Rambler. I wouldn't say that. And probably whoever that witness is who came forward early on and said about this green car, they probably wouldn't either. They probably don't really know what a Rambler is. I hate to keep going back to Delphi, but remember, in Delphi, one of the descriptions of the vehicle was that it was a PT Cruiser, which is weird because how many people are driving PT Cruisers these days?
And it's kind of distinctive.
And
even I, as a not car person, kind of can tell.
When you look at Richard Allen's car and you compare it to a PT Cruiser, you can see, oh yeah, it kind of looks like one. But still, that person said a PT Cruiser. It wasn't a PT Cruiser. Same thing here. It's hard for me to really grab onto that. Now, Mickey, if I thought Mickey was credible, maybe I'm like, okay, car guy who has an interest in this case, knows the girl, says it's not a Rambler. Okay, but as Alice said, there are so many problems with him.
So many problems.
And let me just say this, not to skip away from the car, but just because they are connected, you know, we do have this other guy at the party who said, I think that Lizzie confessed.
Thad, Melantine or something like that. Thad.
Exactly, Thad. I don't put a lot of stock in him either. And we said that when the affidavit came out. Just the notion that you now, some 20 years later, are suddenly remembering that this person you've known your whole life confessed to a murder and you never mentioned it to your wife. I thought that was interesting that he brought up because he's right. I mean, one of the best points he made, and, you know, everybody's different, so maybe this isn't true. The first thing I would have said when I got in the car with my wife, no matter how drunk I was, would be like, you'll never believe what I heard tonight. Like, that would be the first thing I'd say. So I did think that was powerful, but I just don't put a lot of stock in either one of these people revealing something from 2 decades ago.
Right. And that's us being like, we're being consistent here. Although I do think their memories are slightly different because Mickey, from what we understand, what he told Skip, is that he had a consistent memory from 2000 the night of Aisha's disappearance. He always remembered. He's like, well, the police know, the police know, all the way to 2004 when he finally told police. Whereas Thad himself, even I think it came out in the affidavit in like his questioning, was like, I think I remember this. I was drunk. I was drinking. She was drunk. And it's now just coming up because I'm seeing it in the news all the time. So he recognizes in himself, this might not be real. I think he had some questions about whether false memories could be sussed out in a polygraph test. So they are slightly different, but that's why I don't really put much stock in either of their memories 24 years later. Whereas you could see Skip pulling Mickey real close. Everything Mickey says is true. No way that the Green Rambler from the Dedmons is involved, because Mickey 24 years later says, I'm a car guy. No way it's that car. Whereas Thad, who says, I am friends with the eldest daughter and I heard this at a party and she confessed to me, they're pushing him far away. I would say I have to push both of them far away in terms of credibility as witnesses. After I talked to them, I'm not even sure, like, if there was an indictment in this case and I was taking this trial. Two of them are both pretty bad witnesses. I'm not sure I would necessarily put either on the stand. That's how weak both of them are as witnesses right now. Now, the thing that he really had to deal with, so it wasn't that he created the straw man, but the defenses he was putting up was not really effective in the sense of, if that's not the theory of the case, then you don't really have a story. The thing that kind of, unless you can attack it at the end of the day, still leaves question marks. It doesn't necessarily show guilt or point fingers to anybody, but the biggest question mark that can't just be explained away with faulty memory or whatnot is DNA from the youngest daughter, the 13-year-old daughter, and a man who is not part of the Dedmon family, but was cared for by the Dedmon's family's business where they had a lot of interaction. And we know that those two DNAs, those two people, the youngest daughter and this man who lived in the facility, did not interact with each other, at least is what Skip told us. Those two DNA are found on the backpack that was double wrapped and found many years later without Aisha, right? But it's in Aisha's belongings. Now that is not just, say there is other DNA. I believe there is other DNA in that backpack. But when you're going to have a lot of DNA, whether touch DNA, their own DNA, their family's DNA, the Asha Degree family DNA. But these two should not be there. They shouldn't be together because they apparently didn't interact with each other. The 13-year-old, no indication that she drove a car to transport these residents, nor did she work at the actual resident place. So why are those two together? They shouldn't be. And then why are they with Aisha when repeatedly Skip said that there was no interaction between the 13-year-old daughter and Aisha and they didn't know each other? Now that is interesting. It's kind of like when we get a cell phone dump. Obviously in a cell phone dump, we're going to get lots of pings. We're going to get lots of phone numbers. Most of it's not going to matter until we see a pattern of things that shouldn't be there. So the fact that there's lots of other DNA does not cancel out the fact that two pieces of DNA that actually do relate to each other by a degree of separation is found somewhere it shouldn't be. And he didn't have an answer for that. He did say, it's just a little bit. I don't know why it's there. I agree. I don't know why it's there. It may mean nothing, but that is very powerful. And again, we're talking about law enforcement. If I have that and I'm not pursuing that to understand why these two DNA that are 1 degree separation apart from each other are found in the backpack, then I'm not doing my job as an investigator.
And let me just say this, because somebody's already made this point in the chat, and it's a good one. You can explain away the 13-year-old's DNA. You can say, look, she was another kid in the area. Could have been a shirt that was picked up at a thrift store. Could have come into contact with her somewhere else. Any number of things. Let your mind run crazy. But what is more difficult to explain is how there are two people related to the Dedmons, one of whom is a disabled elderly guy at a rest home.
Who was so sick that he died a couple years later.
Right.
So like fully dependent on the residential care of the Dedmons.
Yeah. How do both of them show up? And I thought Skip was pretty honest about this. Like, he doesn't know. He can't explain that. And he's right. If anything ever comes of this, how this was tested, how it was gathered, making sure there was no contamination, making sure that the science behind the match is good, making sure that this is a real match, not a consistent with her and, 100 other thousand people in North Carolina. Like, how strong are we talking about? And we don't know any of that information. And it could be that at the end of the day, it's overstated somewhat. and the strength of this DNA evidence as presented in the affidavit, because remember, it's not the same sort of standard as we're looking at in a trial, turns out to be much weaker. That may very well be the case. But it needs to be something like that. Otherwise, that is just so hard to explain. And he makes good arguments about the cars being different. The fact that the title was entered after Asha disappeared. There are ways to explain that. You've all come up with ways to explain it. But I was going to tell you, that should have been in the affidavit. The police, if they knew, and frankly, they should have pulled that title, that should have been in the affidavit. They should have made that point, and then they could explain it, just like Alice did. You know, it's only a month. People often don't immediately record a title, et cetera, right? There's all sorts of ways you could do that. But they didn't include it, and I think they should have.
One thing I'll note, if I'm remembering the affidavit correctly, they described the car, but I don't think the license plate was in there. So I'm thinking best case scenario, they didn't know what to pull for records until after that. Again, I'm not defending them. I'm remembering what was in the affidavit, and if the available information, so you can imagine they're peeping through like the gate and they're like, I see a green Rambler, but they may not be able to, I don't even know if there's a license anymore, if it's drivable. So it's possible, and this is why investigations are ongoing. Imagine this. They're like, oh my gosh, we have a witness who said green car. They like are doing surveillance around and they're like, what the heck? Why do they have like 20 cars in there? It's like a junkyard. What is that green car? Huh. Okay, everything's obscured. There's a front end damage. It's not drivable anymore because I don't think they drove it for a long time. So it's possible there's not even a tag anymore for them to run it. But once they seize the car and they have the VIN number and they run it through and they're like, well, crud. He didn't even own it then. Well, let's ask some people. Okay, actually, it came from this neighbor who moved that day, so he used the car until then. Okay, this is actually the date. We're no longer going to pursue this. And it's possible that's what would happen if we were investigating the case and we found information that then turns it. Doesn't mean our initial affidavit may have been misleading, but if I knew that information, didn't put it in the affidavit, then that's a problem. But if I find out after the fact, now I have to change my theory of the case, or I have to change kind of how I go about this. This green Rambler can't be part of my theory going forward unless I've interviewed someone who said, oh, whatever, that came from grandma. She was across the street. She was like, she lost her ability to drive cars, years before. And the girls, played around with the car all the time. They drove it all the time in the backyard, as honestly a lot of kids do, like on farmland, right? So I know all this to say, this is actually why you typically seal search warrants. Because things change once you get information.
And I bet if there's a search warrant this September, and part of it's based on the green Rambler, you're going to see that. The affidavit will have changed. That information will be in there. They'll say that it was registered later, but they'll say who it came from, how the transfer happened, that although the title wasn't registered for a month later, it's possible they had it 2 months before, et cetera, right? Like you'll see that if there's a new affidavit. But look, perfectly reasonable attack on that, and I thought that's pretty good. I mean, that was pretty smart to look that up and realize, oh yeah, they didn't even own the car at the time. Now, it was a month later, not a year later. If it'd been a little bit more time, it would have been a little bit more powerful than it was. But the DNA is just hard to get around. We talked about the text messages, but who knows, right? I mean, you take those anyway. It's just, you're reading the text messages, you're interpreting through the lens of what you believe. And if you believe they have nothing to do with it, then you see it as, which is perfectly reasonable, family trying to figure out what's going on when everybody's pointing the finger at dad. And that's what they're doing. And that makes sense to me. If they are involved, then there's a lot of those text messages that take on a much different hue. But in order to know that, you kind of know if they're involved, right? So those text messages might eventually be evidence, but they'll be built on a lot of other evidence first.
And let me say this from a law enforcement investigation perspective. I don't think the inclusion of those text messages in the warrant were meant to build the narrative. It was to get access to the cloud account. So you can't just say she has a cloud account. You have to show the judge there's a cloud account and it's likely to contain information that can be helpful to the investigation. Why? Because they're texting about it. They're texting about this case, which means, and she has a cloud account, therefore we should get access to it. That's why, from my perspective, that's why it's included. Not just to build a narrative to say, judge, see, they're so guilty. It's her own words. I'm so nervous. Don't talk to anyone until you get a lawyer. I'm going to be sick to my stomach. Poor dad. That's not the point. The point was actually to show the existence of something they needed to seize. And so we often do that too. And you're not going to show the entire text message because all you have to do is establish that it's there and that it could contain fruits for the investigation. That's why when Skip was like, that wasn't the entire conversation. I don't know if you've seen my text messages, but like it could fill up, entire room printout. It would be tens of thousands of pages of text messages if you were fully inclusive. All you have to show existence and that it's likely to contain things, because we're not going to go on a fishing expedition. Let's say I had a Gmail account. I have a couple Gmail accounts that I've never even opened. I don't know what's there. I probably opened it to get some discount on a credit card. I don't know. So if someone was trying to search it, they would be hard pressed to show me ever using that account and using that for purposes of, either furthering a crime or discussing elements of a crime for them to gain access to that email account.
And I think that's why the purpose of a document you're looking at is so important. Like whenever you read a document, always have in your head, what was the purpose of writing this? Because take the text messages. Skip would say, look, I'm after the truth. And so I think we need more context here because context will support my argument that these people are innocent. It's not that the police aren't after the truth, but their purpose for writing the affidavit, like Alice said, is to show probable cause for this document. When you see a complaint, you read a complaint and it's got all sorts of just salacious allegations. Well, remember, the whole point of that is, if it's public, to make a splash, but also, to support their argument, to support discovery, all these things. So you don't just take that as true. Well, they said it in a complaint, so it must be true. Or in the response, they said this. Or in a motion to dismiss, they said this. I mean, people do this all the time. The number of times a defense attorney files a motion to dismiss and people act like the world's ending. Well, they filed a motion to dismiss. Oh my God, what's going to happen? We need a legal brief right now to explain what's happening here, right? Like we get that all the time. It's like, yeah, of course they filed a motion to dismiss. They're defense attorneys. Don't assume everything they say is true. Like read it critically, and you have to do that. The purpose is so important, and the purpose will define what's in it. I remember once I had a case where we arrested somebody. We were seeking detention. Ordinarily, we file like a form when we seek detention. We just like check a box. But for this guy, we wrote like a brief. It was like 20 pages laying out all the evidence. And we didn't do that because we needed it to get detention. We did it to send a message to his lawyer. And his lawyer, very shortly thereafter, called and wanted to plead guilty. And he said, when we read that, we were like, we got no case here, right? Because we were telling him, look, we got this. And it's the same type of thing. What's the purpose for the document? And it's so important to remember that. And that will help you both determine the truth of it, but also when you see attacks on it, to understand where they're coming from, but why their purpose might not necessarily undermine the affidavit in the same way that they think it does, if that makes sense.
Yeah, with that said, everything that Skip brought up, valid attacks for if you're telling a story that's counter narrative. We're all allowed a voice, especially in this day and age when people get this affidavit, take it out of context in the sense of this is the indictment. It is not an indictment. There have been no arrests made. There are no charges filed in this case, and run with it and say, see, the Dedmons did it. So I understand the counter narrative. But with all that said, he's allowed to have the counter narrative and there's explanations for what he sees, whether I agree with it or not. I do not think there is a problem with the search warrant. I think there is probable cause. It was rightfully granted, and law enforcement should, with the information that they revealed in the affidavit, this was a path they should have investigated. I may have taken a different tact. I don't know the full information in terms of why it was unsealed. May have taken a different tact there, personally for me, especially because it's not like an arrest followed within the next month or the next day or the next week. Sometimes we'll do that. We'll unseal something and then immediately arrest someone. More likely, after there's been an arrest and the indictment is unsealed, then we will move towards unsealing other documents in terms of order of events. So I want to be clear, even though I am game to listen to their side of the story through their PR representative, that doesn't mean anything he said gave me pause about the investigative tool that is a search warrant. It's incredibly important, and I thought it was laid out with probable cause, and the judge was correct in seeing that there was probable cause in order to search the property.
And sort of going back to what we started with, if you're critical of these folks for hiring a PR person, just imagine if they're innocent. Imagine if they have nothing to do with this. Man, that DNA, wild. How did that happen? I have no idea, because we were all sitting around, the fire eating chocolate on February 13th. And we obviously had nothing to do with this. I mean, imagine being in that circumstance. Imagine living in a community where there's this terrible tragedy. And then 25 years later, people are like, oh yeah, you did that. That was you. And then Reddit's talking about you and people are digging up your criminal history and everything you ever did that was bad and building a narrative. You can imagine why they would want to talk. And that was one reason I had no problem letting Skip tell this side of the story. But I think this investigation does continue. And the one thing that worries me, frankly, and I even told Skip, I talked to him on the phone. I said, look, I want your clients to be guilty because I want closure in this case. And this is the first lead we've had in 25 years, you know? But the fact that we've had these 2 search warrants, it doesn't seem like a whole lot's come from them. The fact that the reward has increased several times and is now $100,000, there's some concern there that they may have stalled on this, that they're not making the kind of progress maybe they hoped to make when they got started here. Now, that could not be true. They could be building a case and they just need one more piece and they think that $100,000 will bring it in. But I felt like at the beginning of this year and in February when those new affidavits came out, that by the end of the year, we might have this case solved. I don't know anymore. We're almost August, right? And so we're just going to have to see what happens as it goes forward.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we're on the same page. Those of us who have been following this case, we want the right people to be held accountable for Asha's disappearance. And looking back on it, when I keep bringing up this whole unsealing of the warrants being a little bit questionable, I do wonder if there was a stall and they didn't have anything else to do, so they unsealed it to see if we know that at least 2 people came forward 24 years later with information that would have been bombshells if they came forward earlier. It's a lot harder to see how much weight it holds now, 24 years later. But maybe they're like, if we put a little bit more information out there, maybe someone else can back up Tad. You know, he says this, but like he was drunk that night and he didn't say anything about it until 24 years later. Maybe someone else was at the party and they didn't know the girls and they overheard it. So they didn't have any context for it. But now they're saying, wait, I heard that conversation. I just didn't know who you were talking about because I wasn't friends with you guys. So I wonder if the unsealing was less of a trying to pressure the Dedmons and more the investigation has stalled and it's a bit of a Hail Mary. Here's more information, guys. What else you got? Can you bring forward something that can help us really crack the case? This is just me speculating.
And I felt this way before we talked to Skip, and I think I feel this way even more now. I don't think this was a hit and run. Like, I don't think that's what happened. I mean, I know that's some people's theory, but I never thought that's what happened. I've said that before. You know, like, they talk about the front end damage on that Rambler. That wasn't made from hitting a little girl. That car was made in the 60s. You could run that car into a wall and not notice. Cars didn't crumple like they do now. It was incredibly dangerous that they didn't, but that was sort of sexy. Oh, there's a green car with front end damage. Wow. I just don't think that's what happened. And so for me, I'm very receptive to several of his attacks on the quote unquote evidence because I don't actually think that's what happened. So, you know, that's the double-edged sword of all this. And I'll say one other thing. People want to put significance in the fact that they've done all these searches and didn't find anything. Recall, it's been 25 years. You know, I don't know if they would have found anything. Like, let's say that it was the dad and he did this. They might not have found anything a day later, a week later, a year later. Talking about 25 years later, finding something would be a miracle. So I don't know. We're just going to have to see if any more information shakes loose. And we have had, as Al said, there are 2 people, whatever you think about them, whatever you think about their testimony, coming forward 25 years later saying, I have information. So
Exactly. Well, you're basically hearing how we would talk about an interview after, we interview someone. We don't have full information. There's a lot more out there, but this is kind of giving you guys an insight into what we were thinking as we were having the interview. And I don't even think we talked about this interview really until now. So I hope you enjoyed this. And if you have any thoughts, you heard the same interview that we had. If you have different thoughts, we welcome them. And the biggest, most important thing here is, we covered Asha's case on the other podcast, the Prosecutor's Pod, like almost 5 years ago now. It is a case near and dear to our hearts. 25 years is a really long time for Asha's family not to have any answers, any closure. And I really do hope this is still the year that there can be closure and justice for Asha. But it's not going to come about with keyboard warriors. It's not going to be those of us on the internet who point fingers without knowing more information. So Some of you have said, if you know something's come forward, you may be the missing piece of the puzzle. But why are you criticizing the two people who came forward 24 years later? We're not criticizing them. We're assessing them critically, which is very important. That's how you should look at all evidence. That's what we do on every case that we cover, is look at every piece of information critically. And when there are aspects that should be criticized, you should criticize them. But don't just go out there and start pointing fingers at people if you don't know anything. If you have information about this case, please let the police know. Let us know. We'll direct it to the right place if you don't know where to reach out to. But this is real lives. This is not just us breaking down, analytically in a witness interview that we had. We are all just trying to get to more answers for Asha and for her family. Anything that you'd like to add, Brett?
The last thing I'll say is, if you haven't listened to the Skip Foster interview, listen to it, and listen to it with an open mind. Obviously, as evidence piles up, your mind starts to close, and that's fine because you're reaching a decision based on the evidence. But remember, all we have are these affidavits, and we've told you all the reasons that they don't necessarily mean what we think they mean. So don't let your mind close just because the police put an affidavit in a search warrant. Listen to what he has to say. Analyze it critically. Some of the parts you may agree with, some of the parts you may disagree with, but I think you'll have a better understanding of the case and really what's going on than if you close your mind based on what the police have said already.
Well, guys, we always love hearing from you. You can reach out to us at prosecutorspod@gmail.com. Thank you to Skip Foster for being brave enough to come on the show. He is welcome to talk to anyone that he wants to. We didn't reach out to him. He reached out to us, and we said, we're going to ask questions, and we did. And he came on, and, I appreciate the job that he has to do, but also the fact that he covered Asha's case as part of the Shelby Star. He was a journalist at the time that Asha disappeared, and I do think that is genuine. Separate and apart from the Dedmons, he did cover this case. This is his neck of the woods, and like many in the area, Asha's case has deeply affected many, many people, and I hope that renewed attention, can bring focus and bring the evidence that is needed for the police to reach justice in this case. But until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs.
Hey.
Great.
Okay. Can you believe we recorded for years on the phone?
I know, right?
It's kind of wild.
It just shows you how good we are.
Yeah.
Truly, we can get the same interaction without having to see each other.
I know. It's crazy. Some people would say we were better back then. Okay. I'm going to go live.
They didn't ramble as much.
To the people.
It is true that we get more distracted. I know. We get more distracted seeing each other. So that is absolutely true. We ramble more seeing each other. There's more After Dark material. Okay. I'll take it up.
This summer, Pluto TV is exploding with thousands of free movies. Summer of Cinema is here. Feel the explosive action all summer long with movies like Gladiator, Mission Impossible, Beverly Hills Cop, Good Burger, and Transformers: Dark of the Moon. Bring the action with you and stream for free from all your favorite devices. Pluto TV. Stream now. Pay never.